To understand the causes of the riots in Singapore in the 1950s, we need to put them in context. What was the mood of the people in Singapore in the 1950s? Recall that though the British made some effort to solve the post-war problems, the people remained discontent with the British as many of these problems continued to recur. This led to many workers and students taking to the streets to express their discontent, those strikes and riots. Merdeka, which means freedom, became the rallying cry among the people and the generation of local political leaders such as David Marshall and Lee Kuan Yew, who emerged during this period. The 1950s was also the period of British struggle against the communists in Malaya, known as the Malayan Emergency, which lasted from 1948 to 1960. In the context of the people's discontentment towards the British, the Maria Herto riots in 1950 erupted. This was a riot involving a custody battle over a 13-year-old girl called Maria Herto. Following the end of the riot, there was increased resentment towards the British governance of Singapore. The British also decided to grant the locals more political power. Similar to the context of the Maria Herto riot, as well as the British desire to improve the defense of Singapore amidst the communist threat, the anti-national service riots erupted in 1954. This was a clash between the students and the police, who was unhappy with the National Service Ordinance in 1953. One of the consequences of the riot was that it encouraged the Chinese-educated students to be more politically active, and this led to the formation of student groups such as the Singapore Chinese Middle School Students' Union, also known as the SCMSSU. Another consequence was that the British grant the locals more political power through the Rendell Constitution in 1955, which gave Singapore limited self-government. What does this mean? The people were now able to elect locals to control certain areas of the government, and an election was to be held in 1955. The 1955 election saw the Labour Front as the winner, with David Marshall becoming the first Chief Minister of Singapore. The 1955 Hock Lee bus riots presents David Marshall with a stern test. This was against the context of the people's discontentment towards the British, and after the British have granted Singapore some form of self-government. The riot was a clash between the striking bus workers, who was also supported by the students from the Chinese medium schools, and the bus company. The riot was resolved in a form of an agreement between the unions and the Hock Lee Bus Company. However, many trade union members remained suspicious of the government and continued to organize rallies and protests. Unimpressed with David Marshall's government handling of the riots, the first Merdeka talks in 1956 failed. The talks were negotiations to press for Singapore's self-government. Following the failure of the talks, David Marshall stepped down as Chief Minister and was succeeded by Lim Yew Hock. Under Lim Yew Hock's government, another riot occurred in 1956. The riot was a clash between the Labour Front government and the Chinese middle school students defying against the Labour Front government move to shut down the student union, also known as the SCMSSU. Though the riots increased the people's distrust towards Lim Yew Hock's government, whom the people saw as running dogs of the British were impressed with his tough approach in handling the riots. This led to the success of the Second Merdeka talks in 1957, which secured full internal self-government for Singapore. A new election was to be held in 1959. The 1959 elections saw the election of Lee Kuan Yew as the first Prime Minister of Singapore.